struggling a lot with feeling like, okay, I identify as, this feminist, modern woman who is going to have a big career. And I had this idea when I was younger that that's what it kind of looked like to be a modern woman who was like progressive and feminist and all these values that I identify very strongly with.
Hello, everyone. This is Samantha Saxby with another episode of Moms with Benefits. And today I am sitting here with Yasmine and very excited to talk to Yasmine. So, Yasmine has 3 children. Her youngest is 10 months old and her oldest is 5. She is married with her husband and she is a former lawyer. And we're here to talk about today how she was a lawyer and then she entered motherhood and really decided she needed to pivot in her life. And so we're going to dig deep on this pivot that she made and what the decision was, how did she make it, what the challenges were, and how she overcame it and where she's at today. So, Yasmine, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Samantha. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Awesome. All right. So, a former lawyer, I mean, that is impressive in and of itself. And so, when we think about motherhood, when you were a lawyer pre kids, what did you envision?
I remember on my first day of law school orientation, a practitioner came in and talked to us about the unique challenges that women in the legal field face, especially in private practice. And she was showing us all these graphs about how women in private practice kind of drop off with each year as they decide to have kids, and there are, barriers within that field specifically. I mean, across all fields, but traditionally a very male dominated field. And so I think I had this kind of subconscious like feeling of me of, well, that can't be me. Like I can't be a statistic. Like I'm gonna stay in law and make that work. And for years, I think that drowned out like years, even just I mean in law school, and then I actually did a master of law after law school. And the whole time I had this voice inside me being like, I don't know if this is super aligned actually with like who I am and what I want. But I don't know. I just had this like determination to kind of make it work almost to a fault. And then I remember my articling year was very intense and kind of grappling with like, is this gonna like, I was getting close to, around the age when I was starting to think of having kids. And I remember just being like, how is this gonna work? But I thought, okay, people figure it out, I'll figure it out too. And then I articled in Toronto, and then I moved to Frankfurt, Germany. My husband's German. We moved to Frankfurt together, and I got a job in a big law firm there. And the work-life balance was really non-existent. And I was pretty unhappy. Like I just felt very misaligned. I had good colleagues, and it's not that I didn't find anything interesting about it, but I just felt profoundly misaligned. I knew that something wasn't adding up for me. And then I got pregnant. And I remember thinking, I don't know how I'm going to make this work, because my husband also is a lawyer, also worked at a large law firm and worked, very long hours. And I thought, with both of us working these crazy long hours, how's this going to work? And then at the same time, I also felt like, well, I can't, again, that little voice, like, I can't be that statistic of like, why does it have to be the woman? But then at the same time, I also wanted to take a step back. I was not loving that career path for me. So anyhow, yeah, my son was born, and in Germany, maternity leave policies are very generous. So I was on maternity leave. I got pregnant 10 months into my maternity leave again. So I kind of rolled one mat leave into the other. And that gave me this really long window of time where I'd stepped back from law. I wasn't seeing those same people every day. I wasn't just exposed to that world. And I feel like that gave me the space and the time to really dig deep into like, what do I want? Why does this feel misaligned? And I kind of went from there in terms of, I decided to pivot, and we ended up moving back to Canada. I went back to school, which felt kind of crazy at 33, but it was the best decision. And I'm really grateful that I was able to do that. And I am on a path that feels much more in sync with my interests and passions and abilities now. So, but yeah, it's been a ride.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So I would love to dig deeper into this word that I heard you say quite a few times of being aligned or being misaligned.
hmm
And so I get what that means conceptually, but what did it feel like for you in the moment or looking back on it? Like, how did that misalignment come to life? Like, how did you recognize it?
I love that question so much. Thank you for asking it. I felt it so deeply in my body. Like, I felt deeply unhappy, and I felt like I was in the wrong place. Like, I just felt like this very deep conviction that I am not doing what I am meant to be doing, and that things shouldn't feel this hard. I think it can be challenging when you are doing something that you are on paper, quote unquote, good at, receiving external positive feedback and validation from society, whether it's like a quote unquote respectable career, or if you have peers who are giving you positive feedback. On paper, everything looks like you are, again, I'm using air quotes, succeeding. But inside, I felt this very large gap between the feedback and validation I was getting externally and just my own mood and happiness and like that gut feeling. I feel like it's like one of women's superpowers is we have this very strong sense of intuition and we know deep down when something is off. And I felt it in my body for a long time. And I think it just grew the more entrenched I became in that path and kind of the harder it felt like it was going to be to disconnect from it. You know, time passes and it gets harder. And the more time passed, the more I felt like, oh my God, I've got to get out. This is not, there's something just that is not working here for me. And I kind of had this feeling of like, it's now or never. And I think that actually, yeah, like again, my maternity leave is kind of what gave me that space to just really drill down and connect with, okay, well, what do I want to do instead? Because it's all fine and nice to think, well, this isn't for me. But I mean, it's not enough to just think this isn't going to work. I think it's the first step. But the obvious next step is, well, you've got to figure out what else that's going to be. And that was equally hard. But yeah, I think that feeling of misalignment for me really presented as a feeling of disconnect within myself. So the external was not matching up with the internal.
Totally. That is, I think, super insightful, very vulnerable. And so thank you for sharing. I felt like I was in the wrong place, is one of the phrases you said. And that's really powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I totally agree that I think us as women and us as mothers have the strongest sense of intuition. And we just got to listen to that voice and let that voice be heard. So interesting concept that, okay, if you feel like you are in the wrong place, unhappy, it shouldn't feel this hard, that's one step of the equation. The next step is, what are you going to do next? And so I kind of have my next question is twofold of how did you figure out what you're going to do next? And kind of a part B is during your maternity leave, you said that it gave you the space to be able to step away from work a little bit and get that space. I'm curious if the act of being a mother and having kids to care for had influence on what you did next.
Absolutely, 100%. If it's okay with you, I'm going to answer questions in reverse order.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I think that motherhood gave me a lot of clarity. I love being a woman. Like and the older I get, the more I'm like, man, like I am just so glad I was born a woman. And I feel so connected with other women and other moms and just so grateful for that part of my life. And I think there are so many challenges though to being a woman. And especially now, and this, I mean, yeah, this was my personal experience, but struggling a lot with, and I promise this seems like a divergence, but I am going to answer your question, struggling a lot with feeling like, okay, I identify as, you know, this feminist, modern woman who is going to have a big career. And I had this idea when I was younger that that's what it kind of looked like to be a modern woman who was like progressive and feminist and all these values that I identify very strongly with. And then when I was living that life, it did not feel right to me, as I explained. And then being on maternity leave with my son, I felt, I mean, I'd always known I wanted to be a mother, and I felt this whole other part of me come alive. I felt like I was doing what I was meant to be doing. I felt so fulfilled. I also knew that I didn't want to, what's the right way to put this? Like, I didn't feel like I wanted to say, okay, I'm going to throw my hat in solely to like stay at home motherhood and have my kids and then stay home kind of forever. I knew that there were other things I was interested in, and I wanted to try and find a way to pursue those other things, but prioritizing space and time for my kids while they were little. And I think reconciling that wish with, okay, I can want that and prioritize, my children and my family while still being a quote unquote, modern feminist progressive woman. Like, that was work that I had to do myself in terms of just untangling what my idea based on kind of social cultural norms and kind of information, like just what that looked like, and then what my reality of like, okay, no, like feminism for me is about choice. And that was just a process. Honestly, it took me a couple of years to get there. And I would say I'm still kind of getting there of like, how to reconcile comfortably prioritizing motherhood, like with confidence, while also making room for myself, my own interests and passions and what I want to pursue, knowing that you can view things just as chapters. So this is what this chapter looks like right now, and I'm setting myself up for, a different chapter once all my kids are in school or, whatever. So yeah, the clarity that having my kids brought me, I would say, is related to values. It helped me really get clear on like, okay, my values are that for me right now, like I feel best and I feel most aligned making the time for my kids when they're really little, and especially not even like what makes me feel aligned, but like that clarity of this is not for me, right? Like I cannot imagine myself going back to a career that does not make me feel a sense of purpose and that I feel drains me so much. And with the disclaimer that that is a huge privilege to be able to take that view. And I'm very aware of that. And I feel really lucky. But I think that was what I got initially the most clear on, was after having my kids, I thought, okay, that's it for me. Like I'm not going back to that career. And then I would say in terms of deciding what to do instead, I honestly approached it in a very like analytical researcher sort of way. And I thought about, there were two areas that I had always been interested in and always thought, oh, if I could go back, if I could rewind the clock, here's what I would want to do instead. And they were psychology. And I thought of like, oh, I wish I was a clinical psychologist. That was one. And then design, and specifically service design. I have a very good friend who, studied industrial design, was a UX designer, and then has had this really interesting career in the service design and UX space. And I would always talk to her on the phone and ask her about what project she was working on. And then one day she said to me, actually, when I was on mat leave with my first son, she said, I don't understand why you're so miserable in law. Why don't you just do design instead? Like, you're always asking me about this. And it had never dawned on me that would, even be a possibility. And even in the moment, I was like, haha, like I wish. But then when I decided, okay, I've got to find something else, those were the two areas that I realized quickly, okay, those would be my dream kind of things. And then the third option, which I did entertain, was going to be sort of the easiest, which would have been to do something law adjacent. So I don't want to practice law in, a firm or in government, but I could do policy or, all these people. I feel like when you go to law school, people are like, oh, you can do anything with a law degree. And I would challenge people who have said that, because I did the research and I don't think that necessarily is true. But that was my third kind of safe backup option. And then I just honestly like researched the heck out of those different paths and what would be required. And I looked people up on LinkedIn. I like stalked people who had similar trajectories of bouncing from one career to another. And I reached out and I just, asked for like a Zoom chat. And I spoke to some professors in psychology at University of Ottawa and just basically did my homework around, okay, what would I be looking at in terms of cost, number of years, and just kind of personal demands on like time, and because that obviously impacts my family. And then I wrote it all down in a table, and I kind of, I guess, tried to strike a balance between evaluating those objective criteria and then what was sort of in my gut. And I determined, okay, psychology is just, there are too many variables. Like I would have loved to do that, but I realized the odds that like would have had to go right back to undergrad. And anyway, it was a bit too risky for me. And the time requirements it was a bit too much. I didn't feel comfortable also just putting my family through that. And then design just seemed like this great sweet spot. Like I was able to apply directly to grad school, and in Canada, at least, like a lot of grad programs, you get funded, you can work as a research assistant, as a teaching assistant, and that helps offset the cost of tuition. So the financial burden was also much less on my family than it would have been had I chosen an alternative route. And then I applied and got a place, and it just kind of all happened. We moved back to Ottawa in Canada, where I grew up, and I started school like less than a month later.
Wow.
So yeah, that's kind of, I don't know if I think I answered your questions.
You did. And so I'm curious, I'm going to call it the process of pivoting.
Mm-hmm.
How long would you say it took from start to finish?
I think there are two.
And I get that we're never finished.
Yeah, that's true. No, but I think there were two. I would say there are two answers. So the internal pivot that for me consists of coming to the realization and accepting I no longer want to or am going to do the career that I'm in. I'm going to choose something else. Okay, here's this thing I'm choosing. I'm doing that now. That is like for me, like the full pivot. And I would say that took honestly probably 4 years. I think I started to really feel that sense of disconnect and misalignment in 2017. So the year before my son was born. And it took me, I would say, we moved here when he turned 3. I would say it took me honestly like 3 years of kind of just the mental side of things. So getting to the point where I felt like I could accept stepping away from my legal career, because I've not once regretted it, not once. And this is a side, like very small, short anecdotal story, but my husband just got made partner a few weeks ago. And it was so interesting because I'm an only child. I'm generally like a very competitive, kind of jealous person. And one of my girlfriends said to me, we celebrated him, and she was like, is there any part of you that like, in this moment, seeing someone get this big win in that career, like, does it give you any pang? And I was like, the thought had not even crossed my mind. Like, that is how at peace I am with that decision. So you could, like, that is true. And then at the same time, it is also very true that parting with that part of my identity was difficult. I think, especially when something is like, feels very hard earned. And our career and what we do every day is such, I think, in my opinion, a disproportionate piece of our identity and how we present ourselves to the world. And I remember thinking, like, what am I going to say when people are like, well, what do you do? Because that was always I'm a lawyer. And then everyone's like, oh, cool, wow. Or, some kind of, insert like positive social like connotation here. So just that process of like disentangling myself and my own identity and like value and worth from that job and function and role, and then making the decision to do something else and then finding what that other thing would be and then doing that other thing. Yeah, I would say like all told, it was 4 to 5 years. The actual kind of moment of like, okay, I am quitting this and applying to something else was more like, I guess, a year and a half. But it's a long process.
Yeah, and understandably so. I mean, there's a lot of, like you talked about, the mental stripping away of identity and rebuilding your identity and assessing your values. And it makes sense that it would take, in your case, 4 years. And I would say, like, that is a point of encouragement to anybody who's thinking about a pivot. It doesn't happen overnight, and it takes time to be thoughtful and purposeful. And I love that your approach was so analytical and research based and really reflective too, to make sure that what you were going to do was going to feel aligned. So I think that's really just really inspirational and a really great, case study, if you will, of how to go about it. So thank you. So one thing I want to touch on that you mentioned a couple times, and I might be insinuating here, but you mentioned how sometimes you didn't want to impact your family in certain ways. And so my mind goes to financial impact as one of the ways that you could be impacting your family. And so I would also imagine a lawyer's compensation is higher than an average compensation. And so, how did the financial impact of this pivot get thrown into your decision making?
No, it's a really unavoidable part of the equation and part of the puzzle. I was in and am in the fortunate position of having a partner who was also a lawyer, earning, a lawyer's salary. And at the time, my husband was several years kind of ahead in his career, so making more than I was. Not to say that I wasn't still earning a good income and that I didn't feel, I think for me, and I, again, like, I'm fortunate. My husband could see, he was probably would have been the first person to say, like, you should do something else because, like, he knew me before I was a lawyer, and he was like, I've never seen you, like, this is not you, like, so he was very supportive. But I think it was more like, despite knowing that we could make it work on one salary, and I will say too, that was easier in Germany than in North America because the social system is just so much more robust. So taxes are higher, but everything else is cheaper. So the cost of living is just much, much cheaper. So, and we were in Germany. I'm just giving that context because we were in Germany when I originally just said, okay, I'm not going back to work. And I extended my maternity leave beyond the point of still receiving compensation. So my position at the law firm was still guaranteed, but I was no longer getting paid. So we were bearing the financial burden of that in Germany.
And fun fact, Germany's maternity leave that you got was 14 months paid.
Yes. From my firm, I got paid, I forget, like a proportion, I want to say, like, I don't want to make it up, but a good proportion of my salary for the initial, I want to say, like 4 to 6 months. And then basically then the state tops you up. It's like employment insurance. So you'll get either, depending on what you were earning before, you'll get a percentage of that, or like you're capped out at, I think at the time it was 1,200 euros a month. And in a dual income, again, place where the cost of living is just so much more affordable, it's doable. So that was, yeah, such a godsend. Again, not that there was no financial impact, that there obviously was and still is, but I think the bigger consideration for me was the piece of, okay, as a woman who also grew up like with a single mom, parented by someone who always drilled into me, you need to earn your own income and you need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, and should never depend on someone. That was the biggest thing for me. That was probably, yeah, second to just the identity piece and like what does that look like to pivot in that way. I think that was probably practically the biggest consideration and challenge, because it's true, right? Like, you earning your own income is what gives you that independence and just that ability to know that you don't need anybody. And I do think that that's really important, and untangling that, and then ultimately having to compromise, like, that's one of the biggest things. Like, that was a deal I kind of had to make with myself because I couldn't have it both ways. I'm not like independently wealthy. I don't have like a trust fund that I could draw from. Like, it was just like most people, like, that's just not the reality. So yeah, when we talk about the financials, that was actually probably the biggest consideration for me.
Interesting. And it's the concept of you are no longer, at least for a short period of time, going to be financially independent, and you will be relying on somebody else
Mm-hmm.
for a financial income to be financially sustainable.
Yeah. And I think that also, especially when you go from earning a good salary to not earning, well, to then obviously, my mat leave salary, but then to earning nothing, again, even if it's just for a chapter, it's a very different thing. We had a joint account before for things like groceries and like kid related stuff and just household related stuff, just joint expenses. But I'd always had my own income going into my own account. And just, this is a whole other piece, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, like, as women, we are targeted by all kinds of expenses relating to maintenance and clothes and how we look and how we're expected to look, right? Like, that's the kicker is
Mhm.
society kind of expects these things of us, and they're all very expensive. And I am perfectly comfortable using the joint account for, family expenses. And if I need a pair of jeans because then no problem. But that's where for me, I have found it has gotten, and this is very like niche and personal, but that's actually what I have found. I've noticed the most is like, wait a minute, this is like women pay. There's a podcast episode I listened to recently. The podcast is called Money, I think Money by Katie or something. And she has this theory about
I
the
love her.
quote unquote, right? Like the hot girl hamster
Yes.
wheel. You heard that one.
Yes, yes,
It's
yes.
so, oh my God, I had my whole mind blown. And it was talking about this, like just
Mhm.
this hamster wheel that as women we can feel really stuck on, where we are like feeling like we have to bleed money every couple of weeks for like whatever, like keep your roots touched up, and God forbid your nails are looking bad and you better have the most recent
Mhm.
XYZ, whatever. Like it's different for every person, but those kinds of expenses are the ones that I have felt the most kind of uncomfortable with since going down to shared income. And that, has made me just think about a lot of things, engaging with also like questions about, like, even I know, okay, well, the money that my husband earns is earned off the backs of both our labor. And I do think that that is true. And we are both on the same page about that. Like, I am the one, yes, I'm in school. I'm also the primary parent right now. I bring the kids to all their appointments. I do the pickups and drop offs. I do all that stuff that frees up my husband's schedule so that he can work the hours that he works. So I have full confidence in, my kind of entitlement to, like, that's the way that it's working right now in our family. And it's clear to me and clear to him. And then at the same time, there is this like, I'm like, but wait, like not all expenses are created equal, and men and women are not that, we are just, as women, there is more culturally, socioculturally, that is quote unquote required of us. That's really expensive. So anyway, that's kind of a side note, but that is one of the things that I've thought about.
No, it's really interesting that it's related, and but I do love that you and your husband sound like you have the approach of there's paid labor and then there's unpaid labor,
Yes.
but all of that labor is for the household. And so there's a mutual respect there for how much unpaid labor goes into running a household, being the primary caregiver. Like it is massive. And I mean, that could segue us into a whole other load of conversations, but really, really great to hear that you and your husband have that approach with taking care of the house and the kids as well. Funny anecdote about the hot girl hamster wheel. I feel like when I get ready and I put on like just a shirt that's just like, it's clean, it's a normal shirt, but it's not like anything fancy. I think to myself, if this clean shirt was on my husband, would he even think twice? And he would not. He would just go to work and it would be a clean shirt and he would be just fine. So I'm like, you know what? I am using like my husband as like the criteria. Like if it's clean and it's not smelly, we're good to go. I look fine. So yeah, it's interesting.
I love that. I love that. Like, how much brain space am I going to allow myself to put towards worrying about what I look like today? Right?
Totally.
Like,
Yeah.
having that awareness is it's very empowering. Good for you.
Especially on like Zoom and stuff too. I'm like, do I really need makeup every day? Because then I go through, X tubes a month and that's more expensive. And then so yeah, we're getting off the hot girl hamster wheel. Thanks to Katie.
I love it.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for diving in deep to your pivot here. I think super, super deep stuff that we went through, and it's really important. It's really important. So just thank you so much for your honesty and showing us how you were able to pivot successfully. So anything else you want to share with a mom that might be listening right now that's thinking about a pivot?
I think I would just like to say that one of the things I wish I'd known when I had my kids and was really in the thick of untangling, okay, I think I need to do something else. I want and need to do something else, kind of like with my life from what I was doing prior to having kids. I think I wish I'd known at that time how common that feeling is. And because it is, I think a lot of women have kids and then in that new version of themselves discover or kind of tap in to a clarity that they maybe didn't have before, or a reordering of values or whatever you want to call it. And it could look different for different people, but I do think that it is a fairly common experience. And since going through it myself, I've actually, it's like that cliche of you think it's just you, and then you start saying it out loud and you're like, oh my God, so many people experience this. So I would say, like, talk about it, like be vocal with your mom friends or just women in general who you know, like allies, people either in your career space or totally outside, because the more you can talk it out and also discover that you're maybe not alone, the more empowered you are to take action and have that support of like, okay, what would that look like? And like, what can I do? And just seeing other people do it, I think is also just very emboldening. So that's what I wish I'd known anyways at the time, is that it's common and that it's doable.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you, Yasmine, for leading the charge in that department today. So thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Samantha.
Moms with Benefits is chasing financial and emotional stability for motherhood. If you've resonated with any of the stories from our moms, we'd love for you to give us a rating and quick review to help spread the word. You'll also find Moms with Benefits on Instagram @momswithbenefits.org. Keep going and keep growing, Mama.